So one of the most accepted ways of doing Agile user requirements is something called a user story. They've been around for a while, popularized by Mike Cohn, and been picked up pretty generally in the industry. So what is a user story? It's short and simple. It's nothing more than a watered down use case in some examples. We don't want to get too much detail because we don't know when we're going to do this. And as we said before, if we're going to do it later on, we don't want to have it with too much detail on the product backlog. Talk about the things that are more valuable first. We want it short. Again, don't invest too much time into it until we know we're going to do it fairly soon. So just-in-time requirements. Also, it's from the user perspective. We always want to make sure that we're capturing the user's voice and what they want. Sometimes we will state it in our voice as, I want this, but I'm not using this product. We need to make sure it's always from the persona of the person who actually will be interacting with the product itself. Even with technical stories, there are end results for a user. So I might be wanting to speed something up or make something a little bit easier to manage as far as a back-end process. That still benefits someone, and we should use an actual perspective of that person who will be using that product or benefiting from something we do to that product. And focus on discussions. It's often said that a user story is a reminder of a conversation, so that when we pick it back up and examine it again, we start that conversation all over again. We don't want it to become a spec. When it starts becoming a spec, you start having people say, well, I did exactly what was in the spec, and they don't do any more or any less. What we want to say is, this is a conversation, and it's going to trigger another conversation about it when we get closer to talking about it. And while we might get more detail, all the detail will not be captured in this one area. We should still constantly discuss with the product owners and the team and make sure we're doing everything we need to do to accomplish this user story. There's also a common format for user stories, and it follows this general syntax. As some role, I want some feature so that some benefit. And we want to make sure we capture these three parts. They're all equally important. The role is important because we're often really good at saying, I want this feature, but who is the I? Who are we representing? We know it's not us. We're not usually consumers of the products we make. So who is that person that we're actually trying to meet their need? And the benefit is to explore the value of it so that when I'm trying to prioritize one story over another, if I can know what the value is to that customer, I can prioritize it a little bit better. I can do a comparison. So you may not follow this exact syntax, and you don't want to be so mechanical that you always try to fit it in there, but you want to make sure you have those three main elements. So here's an example of a story I've had in the past. As an online shopper, I want to be able to search the online catalog so that I can find items to purchase. We have a clear role, online shopper, and hopefully we have someplace a description of what our online shopper is. And that might be different than an offline shopper. We may have products that you can do a catalog through a handheld device that's not online. We have people who are using some other type of service to submit catalog requests. So it's important to delineate who that shopper is. We have the part of what they want to do, the feature, which is search the online catalog. And then why do they want to do this? So they can find items of purchase. And of course, that's what provides value to them. They find an item, they purchase it. That's what provides us value as a company. Often, user stories are written on cards. And on the front of the card, you write some kind of descriptive title and then the story with those three elements we just discussed. They usually get put up on a wall where you can order them and make that your product backlog. Now, that will work for a company that's all co-located and can see all the same information. Once you start getting distributed, you may want to have some type of digital representation of this, but the user story card is still a great metaphor for how to capture these requirements. So conditions of satisfaction are things that are required for acceptance by the product owner or whoever the product owner is representing, such as stakeholders and users. If you meet these things at the end of the sprint, then we'll consider this done. You have accomplished what I wanted to be done. They represent tests. So usually it represents some type of testable outcome. So if I do this, when this happens, then this is a result. And that's something I can easily translate into automated test or manual testing, but something I can validate. Conditions of satisfaction should also be specific, but not detailed. And there is a difference. Specific is for a given scenario. You have a certain context, and when certain activities happen, then I expect a certain outcome. Where detailed might have implementation that can be left off to a later time, such as I want it in a drop-down, or I want a button that looks like this. And those are things that we can delay to a later responsible moment. We might call those red barn, blue barn questions. So if I'm talking about painting a house, I want to talk about how big the house is and things like that. What color you want, I can talk about later. I can actually talk about that right up to the second I'm going to do it, because it doesn't change the significance of how big the effort will be. And so we call it red barn, blue barn question when that's something that can be answered at a later time. So what are some conditions of satisfaction? Let's go with the user story about search we just talked about. Match against item title, description, and category. So this is telling what fields we actually need to be searching on. So if you have a list of items and you wrote code that would implement this search, you could then go and write a test that says if they enter in these keywords, then if it's in this title or description or category, it should show up. That's a testable component. Allow advanced search technique like quotes, and, or, plus, minus, things you might see in like a Google search. You'll often get requirements like that. I want it to work like Google. So that's something we have to write down though, especially when they give you something so open-ended. Write down a very specific thing. You might also eventually talk about what happens when I put something in quotes, or what happens when I use one of these specifics. And then that could be more detail later. Results should return in 5 seconds or less. It gets a little iffy. This is now talking about performance, but there may be a real need out there. There may be already market research that tells us there's a 5-second drop-off. If it takes longer than that, they're going to go to our competitors. So this is almost a constraint, but it is testable as well. And these are general items that are conditions of satisfaction. There's another technique called how to demo. And you can record conditions of satisfaction by turning to a user representative and saying, if this was completed and I turned around a computer to you today, how would I demo this to you? And they can kind of give you sequential steps, hopefully with not a lot of the implementation detail, just the high levels. So I want to open the search page, I want to enter multiple keywords, initiate a search, and then view results of catalog items that contain one or more of the keywords in their name or description. This is another technique for capturing them. You want to be a little bit careful with this because it's so easy to get implementation details in here. And sequence may change. We may decide to do something in a different order, where this kind of dictates this. As long as everybody can agree that this is a general idea, then we can move forward. So if you remember, we talked about recording these on a story card. So here's our one previously, search catalog. We put the conditions of acceptance generally on the back of that card. So you can see here I'm using actually both techniques, how to demo and then other tests that are a little bit more specific about implementation. And this is something that you continue to write notes on and record information as you go along. This should evolve over time. And even if you keep this up in some digital format, there should be some place that you can spell out these conditions of acceptance. So I'd like to talk about the qualities of good user stories. And there's an acronym already out there for this called the INVEST principle. The I in INVEST stands for independent. If we're trying to deliver these user stories in a small sprint, and we want it to be potentially shippable at the end of that sprint, then it doesn't need to rely on other stories. It doesn't mean that there can't be precursors and successors that need to be in place for the overall application, but the story should be fairly independent and rely on no other stories in itself. The N stands for negotiable. We talked about that a story is a reminder of a conversation. So when we start talking about it again, we might negotiate on some things we talked about previously. We had said we were going to do it this way, but then we talk about it more and we decide to do it that way. If you start trying to make stories a specification, it's harder to change things because you're now trying to write it in stone. So it should be negotiable. The V stands for valuable. If you remember, we talked about the 3 parts of the story. This role for this feature and some benefit. And that's where the benefit part comes in. I need to know why it's valuable. If you don't capture that part of the story, then it becomes hard to tell why it is valuable to the customer, and then becomes hard to order and prioritize against other stories. And the E stands for estimatable. The team should be able to provide a high-level estimate for this feature. It doesn't need to be specific. It doesn't need to be down to the last detail. In fact, you should resist that. But I should get a high-level understanding of how significant the effort is. The S stands for small. Sometimes they'll talk about it as sized appropriately because small is a very relative term, but it should be small enough to comfortably fit inside a sprint. You should hopefully be able to do multiple stories in a sprint. So if you're making them as big as a sprint, you're not really giving yourself any leeway. So make it fairly small and succinct. And T is testable. Remember we talked about conditions of satisfaction, that should be something I can test against. Well, if we're writing good conditions of satisfaction, those should translate into tests. Now I want to talk about splitting user stories. You're going to get all sorts of great ideas coming from sales and marketing. They might want sharks with lasers on their heads, but that's not something you can deliver in a sprint. So you're going to have to start paring those down. And there is a logical order to things. There's a common hierarchy called theme, epic, and user stories. You'll see this sometimes with other types of words, feature, but it's all the same idea of a theme is a large initiative. Something large maybe fits an entire release or multiple releases. An epic is just a story that is too big to fit in one sprint and will need to be broken down. And then the lowest level is the actual user story, which is something small enough to fit into a sprint. When I'm facilitating discussions on stories, we often do this breakdown during the actual discussion. We'll draw on a whiteboard all of the big ideas first. Online catalog, online payment, my account. And then we'll start breaking those down. We break them down into epics, browse catalog, search catalog. These are still big features that might take multiple sprints, so we need to split them down into even further components. So I take search catalog down into the actual search itself, advanced search, where we might be using some of those keywords, and refined search. So when they come back and they may want to say, oh, I only want to see things by this brand. And this actually reflects a breakdown of an actual product we did once. When you're slicing user stories, you want to be careful to be iterative and not incremental in how you build the actual stories. Here's an example of what the difference is. Say, I want a picture of my daughter playing. This is my 5-year-old daughter, Isabella. I want you to do this in 3 steps. If I know exactly what that picture should look like at the very beginning, it would be easy to build pieces of it all the way through. I'd write just the corner, then I do the next corner, and the third one I do the entire bottom, and I've got exactly that picture. That'd be great if I knew exactly what I wanted, and in software we often don't. In software they usually come and have an idea, so I may just have an idea of I want a picture of my daughter playing, and I don't have any specific idea of what that's going to look like. Rather than just trying to build one corner of the piece completely, we'll start off with a sketch. And I can get some feedback and I can say, you know, that's great, but I like some more color and I like some bubbles in there. And then they get a little bit more detail in the next sketch. And I can give some more refinement. And then at the end, we come up with that final picture, but it's built iteratively and it gives me time to make changes as we go along. Where incrementally is a little bit harder to do that because I've done everything completely in smaller components. There are good things to both of these, and you often hear people talk about develop iteratively and release incrementally. So develop things in little phases and layers, and then when you've got enough of a full picture, then you can release that part of the product. So we've been talking about capturing user stories with not a lot of detail in them. Eventually I do need to get some level of detail, so let's talk about when we do that. If you remember, our product backlog is ordered by value, which usually means in the order I'm going to actually deliver them. And that the detail is more detailed at the top and it's less detailed at the bottom. And we're going to be refining this backlog over and over again. So the items that are at the bottom, it's okay if they're less detailed. The ones at the top, coming up in the next couple of sprints, we will get those level of details. What those level of details are different per team, per project, per context. Depends a lot on what your team already knows about the domain. How available is your product owner? How much does the actual requirements change because of your market? Just know that you don't want to get too much detail at the bottom, and you'll eventually get that detail at the top.